A potential deal to save art and help pensioners in Detroit, plus the debate over Oakland County exec Brooks Patterson's Detroit slams and increased GOP anger over Dave Agema. Stories from around the state right now on MiWeek.
Michigan's turnaround is being powered by things we do better than anywhere else in the world. Today's global leaders routinely turn to Michigan to work on their most difficult problems. That's because the engineering talent in this part of the world is simply the best. So many possibilities lie ahead for Michigan's future. These opportunities are here and starting to happen. The vision for the new Michigan. Share it, talk it up, drive it home. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there, and thanks so much for joining us for MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. Tonight, a possible deal to help settle Detroit's bankruptcy and a reminder that if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Oakland County exec Brooks Patterson, who has made a career of saying outlandish things at times, is facing backlash from what he told the New Yorker magazine about Detroit. The debate over an apology coming up. Plus, Republican National Committeeman Dave Agema, who has made a string of inflammatory comments about gays and Muslims, is ducking the RNC meeting in Washington this week amid calls for his resignation. But first tonight, the news that a deal is developing to help pensioners as well as protect Detroit-owned art at the DIA. We first heard about the governor's proposal for state funds to closely match what foundations were contributing last week. But on Wednesday, the governor made it official. He's proposing $350 million over 20 years. That money could come from tobacco settlement funds that Michigan gets. There are some strings attached to this plan that the governor thinks will help resolve the bankruptcy case and protect art at the DIA, as well as help retirees. There would have to be changes in the way that pension funds are managed, and the plan would still have to be approved in bankruptcy court. So far, this is just a proposal.
This is a settlement. This is not a bailout. And I want to be very, very clear about that. This is not a bailout of paying the debts directly of the city of Detroit. This is not a bailout of dollars for Detroit's debts. This is not a bailout of banks and other creditors. This is focused in on helping reduce and mitigate the impact on retirees. It's focused on protecting assets. It's focused on showing good results and allowing the city to move forward by hopefully resolving this case in a more positive rather than a more negative way, faster and better. That could have dramatic savings both in terms of dollars and time. Because this is really about settling it so we can grow the city of Detroit.
All right, let the questions begin. How does this $350 million make a difference? Can you get the state legislators to approve this, even with Republican leadership standing at the front of the room in support? We'll get started with our MiWeek contributors right on this topic. Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's always good to see you.
Good to be Absolutely.
All right, so let's start off with the first question. When we hear about Detroit's debt and we hear that $18 billion figure and we hear $350 million from the state, tell us how that all makes sense and what kind of difference over 20 years $350 million is going to make.
Well, it'll make a huge difference if it can be the final piece in closing this deal. The foundation's raised $330 million. They're asking $100 million from the DIA in additional fundraising. The retirees are going to take a much smaller hit than they took, but they're still going to contribute to this settlement. With the state coming in with this significant a number, I think it seals the deal. And if it heads off future lawsuits, it could get this bankruptcy done fairly quickly.
Okay, it could seal this deal, but there's so many dangling things about this. And one of those moving parts is the DIA and $100 million that they would have to raise. And they've said that that would be very hard for them to do.
It's undoable.
Well, $100 million is a lot for them. I mean, they don't have it. So they'd have to get a donor to come up with that money. I think in the end they will come up with a contribution to this deal. It won't be $100 million. Maybe $25, $30 million is more in the realm of what they could raise from somebody. I mean, everyone thinks the museum is just sitting on money, and that's just not true. They can't use their endowment for this. That would violate the terms of many different agreements.
Yeah, Steve, but that's been the problem with the DIA from the beginning. They can't do anything but sit there and say, well, you know, we can't be part of the solution.
Well, no, they are being part of the
And
solution. They're
I
saying they
think
don't have
they're
$100 million.
Well, they don't have $100 million, but they're going to have to get it. I don't think
Where?
they're going to get away with $25, $30 million. The governor was pretty clear when he talked to us. The foundations have been pretty adamant, and I don't think they can afford to alienate the foundations whom they depend on.
Well, where would you get $100 million
They're gonna
out
have to
of that
do
museum?
additional fundraising. I would reinstate the admission fee. I think people would understand
Which violates
that.
the terms of the millage.
Of what everyone voted
That
on last year.
was a verbal promise that's not written into the millage. That is
Oh, it
not
is written into the
it is not.
millage
That was a
agreements.
verbal promise. It's not written in any way into
But
that
Nolan,
millage
don't you think
passage.
you would undo a lot of public goodwill and people who would want to donate to the museum if you all of a sudden went back on that?
I think people would understand that these are
And if
very
you-
trying times. Look at the zoo. The zoo's got both a regional tax and an admission fee.
And if you think-
the museum, a visit to the museum has value, I think people would pay.
If you think you'd raise $100 million off
wouldn't.
admission fees,
wouldn't.
you're mistaken. I mean,
You need $5 million a year.
Yeah.
Reinstating the admission fee could raise half of that,
Right.
or perhaps a little
You'd
less.
be close.
So then you have to go out and touch the
But
foundation, touch donors.
All right,
I guess
Stephen, go.
what I'm pushing back against is the idea that the museum is saying that they're out. They're not. They've been saying from the beginning that they're in, that they're willing to do what they can. What they have said steadfastly is that they can't sell art, and that's true. They can't sell art because that violates all of the covenants that museums have. It destroys the museum, and that's what this deal
They
avoids.
can't sell art.
so-
They can't lease art. They can't
No,
raise
they
money.
Okay, well then-
they can't.
They can raise money.
Hang on, let me ask you this
is
then.
an independent organization.
If part of this deal depends on them raising $100 million and they say they can't do it, so should we even be still talking about this deal, or is this an integral part that
I don't know that number is the number.
is going to be
that will end up-
is going to be a
Right.
final number?
My point is, they will contribute to this deal. They're working on a way to do that. I mean, you know, one of the things that's a little annoying about this is the museum is not at fault here. The museum is an independent organization that takes no public money at all, other than these millages that they've asked to build up an endowment so that they can be completely independent. Coming after them because Detroit, misspent its money and mishandled the pension funds, I think is the wrong attitude.
All right,
It's a Detroit asset.
let's
Steve.
look
No
at this
different.
deal.
The pensioners aren't at fault either.
The
the
pensioners
people
aren't at fault
the
either. That's
people-
right.
The people who are at fault in this thing are long gone, sitting either in graves or.
Yeah, but I think we're
not
beyond. I think we're
standing
beyond
around.
blaming people. I think we're beyond saying whose fault it is. So let's look at this. Let's step back and look at the entire deal, and let's say that the DIA can come up with $100 million or even $50 million. You still have to sell this to the legislators in
You
Michigan.
do.
You still have to sell this statewide. And it was interesting watching that press conference yesterday, and the governor and what we just rolled here for you said, this is a settlement. This is not a bailout. Are those very important words, Nolan?
Well, they're just words. I mean, it's a bailout, for God's sakes, and it's a necessary.
Oh, wait, so you don't buy the fact that this is, the governor says it's a
settlement for
settlement?
what?
What's a bailout? I mean, it's a bailout. They're giving Detroit money from the state treasury to resolve its problems. That's a bailout, and it's a necessary one. And it's good for the entire state if it gets this bankruptcy settled, and if it gets the state off the hook for any future liability for these pensions. Because remember, that matter hasn't been settled. Those pensions could end up costing the state a lot of money. So if they can get the unions to agree, and if they can get the other creditors to agree, I think it's a good deal for the state. And anytime the governor has had both Bolger and Richardville with him, he's managed to get what he wants. I think they'll get it through the Republican caucus and get this thing passed if the pensioners agree to it.
In an election year, how difficult do you think this is going to be?
I think it's a little bit difficult, but I think Nolan's right. It's key that Bolger and Richardville were both there, and so that that certainly implies that he's got leadership on board, and that matters. When it comes time to count votes, I think this will be a tough sell for some legislators outstate to say, we're sending this kind of money to Detroit, which is not, anybody's favorite charity case. But in the end, what choice do you have? This would make the museum a statewide asset, which is not a bad thing either. So people are getting some sort of benefit back from it. My bigger concern, I think, is what message this sends about underfunded pensions. Detroit is far from the only city that has that problem. In fact, most cities in the state have some sort of unfunded legacy costs, either pensions or health care. If I were any of those cities, I'd be at the governor's door saying, where's our help? You know, what's your solution to try to get us out of this trouble so that we don't end up in bankruptcy court like Detroit?
So is this a dangerous prospect now that he's kind of opened the door for state help for any other municipalities?
Frankly, I hope he has, because I mean, I think this is a problem that state government's going to have to wrestle with at some point, one way or another. We can't allow cities and school districts to make the kind of promises that they've made going forward on pensions and health care and not fund them. That's got to be dealt with, and then the legacy costs now that are hanging over everybody's head have got to be refinanced some way. You have cities that can't afford to meet these obligations.
Yeah, and that is true. I mean, this problem's not going to go away. It's going to continue to escalate. What the governor, what the legislature need to do now is freeze all public pensions in the state and start making the people who are owed money whole, and making sure we don't rack up obligations we can't pay in the future.
All right, so what's the timeline for this plan, going back to Detroit's plan?
Well, I mean, you got to get it through the legislature.
But how fast is that going to be? We've seen them move fast when they want to, but we've seen them drag their feet when they want to.
Well, it'll be a part of the budget address next week, and it'll be part of the budget settlement, I would assume, when they usually do that now. They've been doing that in May and June. Yeah. I assume he'll get for the purposes of the court, they'll get some sort of assurance or commitment that they can get this thing passed, because I'm not sure the bankruptcy court can wait until the budget is actually passed before they act.
No,
and also the goal of trying to get out of bankruptcy in 1 year.
Yeah.
Is that possibility still out there?
Oh, I think so.
Deal?
I think we're moving much faster. You look at what happened in these California cities that were in bankruptcy. You look at what's going on in Birmingham, Alabama, where they're in the county there is in bankruptcy. The comparison in terms of speed is mind-blowing. I mean, we are eons ahead of where they were at this point in either of those cases. So I think, you know, I mean, if we can get stuff like this settled up front, it makes everything else a lot easier. And so a year, maybe less, becomes a much more realistic time frame.
Once the creditors see, the other creditors see that there's nothing left to grab. I mean, if you take the DIA off the table with this deal, what's left to grab? I mean, they're not going to keep fighting a futile fight. They're going to have to settle. I
mean, one of the interesting things about this deal, too, is how much it could help the pensioners. It's not $3.5 billion, but it's structured over a long time, 20 years. If you can get enough of that money up front and do something smart with it, it might grow to fill most of that hole over the next 30 years. And so this idea that the pensioners still might take a hit, I think, could end up being addressed when you take a look at how much cash is going to come in immediately and,
but the governor
what you
was
could
pretty
do with
clear
it.
That it probably wouldn't, and he didn't want to mislead.
Well, you can't promise that it would.
But there was still going to be some kind of
sacrifice
hit
on that part, but not near what it was.
Yeah.
Do you agree that there needed to be some kind of parameters on how the funds are now managed with the infusion of this money?
Yeah, you can't pour state money in and have them continue to be mismanaged, have people continue, as we saw during the Kirkpatrick administration, to take money out for corrupt purposes. They've got to be better managed, and they've got to be fiscally responsible.
But people are still disputing the shortfall, though.
Well, they're disputing, that's a very silly conversation. I mean, one of the easiest answers to that is, if there is no shortfall, then why are we negotiating with the pension funds in bankruptcy court? If the city doesn't owe them anything, fine, go off and manage your money the way that you can and make your obligations as best you can. I think the better question is whether you can treat the police and fire fund the same as you treat the general retirement fund. The police and fire fund is much better funded than the other one, and it doesn't quite meet the requirements under the law for the emergency manager to be able to just wipe it out. So what's the legal context in which you can say, I'm getting rid of that board as well as the general retirement? I mean, it's a technical question, but it could end up hanging us up for
and
a
these
while.
funds have to, I mean, they have to make some really hard decisions here. Do they roll the dice and take a chance that they can prevail in court, that their pensions are untouchable, or do they take this deal for fear of getting dinged a whole lot
No,
worse?
you take the deal. I don't think there's any question you take this deal.
I don't know.
All right, well, we'll watch it unfold now in the next couple of weeks. Another top story this week, Oakland County Executive L. Brooks Patterson has said some pretty off-the-wall stuff before. As a longtime regional leader, he's become known for it. But this week, after the New Yorker ran a piece on Patterson called Drop Dead Detroit, Brooks is really in the hot seat for some quotes he said that he said the writer took out of context, including one he said 30 years ago about Detroit turning into an Indian reservation, and one warning his children never to get gas in the city of Detroit because it's an invitation to be carjacked. Does Patterson need to apologize? And that's my first question for you, Nolan.
Well,
does he need to apologize?
Whether he needs to or not, he's probably going to have to. I think he said he regretted. I mean, we know Brooks and we know how he talks, and you know his mouth is his worst enemy. But I don't think anybody should forget that this is the most effective politician in Michigan today, and he has been for a long time. Runs a very competent government. His administration hasn't sent anybody to jail. And if you look at the others in this region, I don't think you can say the same thing. The things he's done in Oakland County and in this region have been a lot more helpful to Detroit than any comment he may or may not have made. I think his biggest mistake here, and I asked him, what the heck were you thinking, Brooks, was to spend 6 days with a reporter from the New Yorker on the pretense that she was there to do a story about how this conservative Republican was doing such a good job managing his county. That's what he says she told him. I said, she was from the New Yorker. How on earth would you believe that?
All right, does he need to apologize?
I guess I'm ambivalent about whether he apologized. I mean, the damage is done when you say something like this, and the apology doesn't wipe it away. I mean, this was in a national magazine, pretty harsh comments about his neighbor and a place that, frankly, his county depends on and has thrived off of for 30 years. You know, you just can't do this kind of thing. I mean,
yeah, but let's look at what he said. So the carjacking comment, said crudely and what have you.
Yeah.
But you remember when Charlonda Buckman was
sure.
carjacked, and you sat here and said the same thing.
Well,
you tell your wife not to get. So it's
not
nothing others haven't said. He just should have been smarter than to say it out loud to an out-of-town reporter.
that was the benign part of his comments. I mean, he said much worse things about the city than the carjacking thing, and that didn't bother me.
What bothered you?
Well, the Indian reservation thing is you know, beyond offensive. I mean, I'm not sure why you would even think to make that kind of analogy. But
because this is Brooks, and this is the way his mind works. Well, but if you look at what he was saying, he was comparing Detroit to a place where hopeless people are trapped in a geographic area they can't escape and exist on government handouts that are just.
And he was
in the most inflammatory way possible.
Absolutely. But what he said,
I can't believe you're going to make this into a substantive policy statement on his part as opposed to a mocking.
What's the difference between those vast areas of Detroit that have been laid waste and an Indian reservation where people are trapped in dependency?
It was the dismissive.
That's what he was trying to say.
It was the dismissive nature of the comments that we throw in blankets and corn.
It was ill-put, certainly.
Listen, the context for this is horrible, okay? Oakland County and Detroit have had years, decades of racial strife, economic competition that's hurt the whole region as opposed to cooperation. And, you know, for the leader of the county that's benefited from that strife to make fun of the part of the region that has suffered for it is inappropriate. I mean, and you can't make that okay by saying, well, in a policy context, this makes sense. It doesn't.
I'm just saying he wasn't exactly wrong. I mean, his statement certainly. I mean, Brooks can always say things better than he says, but we've been listening to this.
But it's also
watch what he does.
Let me jump in real quick.
Hold on. It's also the refusal to take responsibility for what has happened here. This is not an accident that Oakland County has gotten wealthier as the city has gotten poorer. That's driven by policy, that's driven by race, that's driven by all the decisions we make here. And for him to mock Detroit for the bitter end of that stick that they've suffered under, I think, again, that does touch on much larger things that we need to deal with. And for him to sort of poke at it that way
hang on 1 second, Nolan.
You can't let this go unsaid, that policies that Oakland County benefited from policy. They benefited from bad Detroit policies that drove their residents out. 100,000 Detroiters went to Oakland County over the last decade.
No question.
They don't
no
have
question
a
that,
problem
no
with
question
Brooks
that
Patterson.
the city once the policies were made to allow people and encourage people to leave the city. We're talking about 60
you
years.
can trap people here. If
We're
we can
talking
get out
about
of a
60,
place that
but,
doesn't
but
work.
no other city in America has done what we've done in terms of making it easy and encouraging people, and again layering the incredible racism that kept blacks in the city on top of it. It hasn't happened anywhere else.
And driving people out with poor services, people are still leaving.
But
it's
why did
black
the services,
people leaving now,
But
Steve.
again, it's the question: why did the services get so bad?
Well, corruption, mismanagement, ineptitude, on and on
Flight
and on.
of money from the city into the
Well,
suburbs.
it's a chicken and egg argument.
All right.
You don't leave a place that's safe, where you're happy, where you have good schools and a good quality of life. You don't leave those places.
But whites began leaving Detroit because of African Americans, and left and created communities that African Americans were not allowed to join. So that's what started the whole thing. And the idea that somehow the city should have been able to survive under that kind of when you take that
talked
kind
about
of money.
taking responsibility. You said Brooks had to take responsibility.
Sure.
I think Detroit has to take responsibility.
We mismanaged
for its own
the
demise.
decline that the city didn't start.
And contribute to it.
All right. Well, far be it from me to interrupt a Nolan v. Steven debate. I was just going to get some popcorn and put my feet on this old table, but I want to bring it back to his words, because there's something that you said, Nolan, that kind of struck me. And it says, well, we all know Brooks. And we all do know in the media. We know him, and he says some flamboyant things, and he says some funny things. But is it time for those kinds of comments to be done with? Is it time to say, when you see it played on a national stage in a national magazine, that there's no place for it?
I mean, this is why Brooks is not governor. This is why Brooks was never realized his political potential. Something pops in his head, he says it. Should he not do it? Of course he should not do it. But it doesn't take away from the man's effectiveness, his accomplishments, and the fact that every other leader in this region is trying to mimic the way he runs his county. And that's not luck. I mean, he has put innovative policies in place.
Will it affect his relationship going forward with Mike Duggan if he does not apologize?
Well, it's not luck, but it's a little like bragging you won a race when you did have a 30-yard head start. That was policy-driven, right? I mean, come on. Let's not pretend that it's accident that Oakland County benefited while the city suffered.
If Bob Ficano were county executive of Oakland County, that county would have a deficit now.
Because he's an inefficient manager in that way. No one's taking that away from Brooks.
Brooks put in some of the most innovative financial practices in the country.
No one is taking that away from him, but that's like saying, well, I beat my kids, but I cured cancer. So don't talk to me about beating my kids.
And I say Brooks's mouth gets him in trouble, but I don't think Brooks's heart is where his mouth is.
All right,
we agree on that. I mean, we both know him well enough to know that's the case. But again, the larger context for this is a much more problematic issue in this region, and his comments remind us of the fact that there's unfinished business there. We have got to switch the way we deal with city versus suburb, with sprawl, urban investment, all of those things. It's starting to happen, but Brooks is,
okay, last word, Nolan, because we got to move on.
I mean, Brooks has been resentful for a long time of this idea that somehow Oakland County, Macomb County, whatever, have this special obligation to subject themselves to Detroit and put Detroit's interests first. He doesn't feel that way. He feels his county also has a purpose and it can stand on its own.
Yeah.
All right, let's move along. In another case of what you say has consequences, calls to bounce Dave Agema as Michigan's RNC rep are getting louder. His most recent attack on Muslims on his Facebook page seems to be the last straw for Republicans. He has also made inflammatory comments about gays in the past year. This week, Congresswoman Candace Miller, Congressman Fred Upton, and Justin Amash want him to step down. And really, those calls started with Betsy DeVos. If she had not started the calls, would have other people jumped in line? I guess my question is, why did it take so long for this? Why was this the last straw?
I mean, it's a cumulative thing. I think people have been grumbling about this for a long time, and it always takes somebody to stand up first. And, one of the things that have sort of kept people quiet is there's not a whole lot they could do. I mean, the party rules won't allow the removal of this guy.
And isn't that ridiculous? I
Sure,
mean,
of course, and
there's
people
no rules for removal?
Well, the only thing you remove him for is not supporting the party's candidate. And that's the way it's written. I mean, nobody anticipated. These are not public positions usually.
No.
These are not positions you hear from. I don't think anybody anticipated you'd have a guy getting this sort of attention.
But he's supposed to be representing a party who's trying to be more inclusive in upcoming election years and encouraging minorities,
Well,
and this is far from it. And he has now dodged out on the meeting this week.
Absolutely, and this is a guy though who, let's look at what happened here, right? RNC, Republicans choose this guy to represent them on a national level, and it's not like Dave Agema woke up 3 months ago and became a bigot. He's been a bigot for a very long time and has not been shy about that. I mean, I've had conversations with him years ago where he says things that are inappropriate. So then the bigger question is, why was the Republican Party okay in the first place?
Well, and they
with
weren't.
choosing
I mean,
this
this was a
guy?
product.
20 seconds, Nolan, and we got to
This was a
go.
product of a major fight within the party. Had really not so much to do with Agema as it did with Solanousis,
right.
and people, certain elements wanting to punish him. And this guy found himself in a position in which he's very capable of embarrassing the party. And now folks want him gone.
Oh, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens on that one too. Thanks, guys. That is going to do it for My Week tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. Head over to myweek.org for more shows and for more conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Christy McDonald. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.
Business Leaders for Michigan is dedicated to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and economic growth. Learn more at businessleadersformichigan.com. Funding is also provided by Delta.